Welcome everybody. I'm David from TPAS Cymru, and today we're discussing rent policy. And we've got a special guest here today, Stuart Epps, Executive Director, Finance and Development at Wales and West. Social housing rents are capped annually, you may be aware, by the Minister under a published rent formula. And so why are we talking rents at the moment? Well, that rent formula has come into an end, or has come to an end actually. And there's an expert group looking at how else could we do rents? How else can we get that balance before about affordability for tenants and allowing landlords to do the things that they need to do? And so TPAS Cymru is part of that group, and our guest today, Stuart, is as well, because he's an experienced and respected finance authority, and we thought that would be a good place to have a chat with. A couple of caveats before we get started. One is this is just a chat. It doesn't represent the views of either of our employers. It's just us exploring rent and rent policy and models and things like that. And the other thing I probably should mention, there's probably a couple of acronyms. CPI is one that will come up a few times. CPI is Consumer Price Index, and it's a measure of prices rising and falling. And it's a tracker that's used in the past in rent policy. I think it's about 3.2% at the moment. But anyway. So welcome, Stuart. Sorry for that quick.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. Good to talk.
Thanks. So maybe perhaps we could start with a little bit of that rent, about the current formula and what's good and bad about it, and maybe why we think we can maybe move into why we think it needs to change, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, interesting, David. You and I both been around a while, and this is probably my fourth rent review that we've looked at now in terms of the way that we put rents together in Wales. So the current rent formula in Wales is essentially that rents are capped, as you say, at CPI plus. The interesting part is how did they start at a number at which they're increased from each year, because there's been all sorts of formula. You'll remember back to the Professor Steve Wilcox days of trying to work out what the right rent in each local authority area was. So it does all stem back from lots of measurements about relative earnings in a particular local authority area, relative house prices in a local authority area, and relative private rents in a local authority area. And that's why we do see, and residents across Wales will see disparity in rents, dependent on whether you're in Merthyr or Conway or Gwynedd or Newport.
Yep.
Because there was a formula that was developed many years ago now, and has kind of always stayed through rent formula of a rent that was designed to be affordable in each area. I think as each rent review has gone by, we've lost a little bit of that link towards affordability. Yeah. And so I think for everybody involved in the process now, you see that rents are going up every year by a ministerially agreed formula. But actually that link back to how did we put those, where did that very first rent come from and how did it start? Yep. And so where are we now? I think it's just got lost in all of this. So I think to your question, where we started on this was trying to think about what was the right rent at that time in a local authority area. And it's got in inverted commas simplified to, well, we'll just increase that rent by CPI plus 1% every year. Yeah. And we've lost a lot of that connection back 10, 12 years ago to where did we start from in that part of it. So yeah. I think that's the bit that for everybody involved in it, it becomes much less, it's much more difficult now for us all to see, is that the right rent that's being charged in those, in any area? And I think the review that Welsh Government have kicked off now, I think it's helpful for us to go back to some of those first principles about rent, which has got to be, as you rightly said at the start, that the rent is clearly understandable in how that affordability calculation has been put into the rent of it. And I just think we've lost a little bit of sight over that over the last decade or so as moving from that starting premise has got further and further away from it.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of how else could we do it then? Is it about, do we need more data? Is it more localized? We've tested some models linking it to energy efficiency that I don't think was well received, but I'm not sure we did the right explanation on it. Linking it locally as well as being tested before, hasn't it? You know, and
Yeah, and there's lots of there's lots of options out there. I think in essence where I come from all of this is that it would be good to have a clearly understood measure of
hmm,
affordability.
yeah,
And lots of landlords are using a model called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation Living Rents model at the moment, which essentially takes what in very kind of technical geeky terms, it uses something called 25th percentile earnings. So it's what does somebody who's at the 25th, you know, the 1/4 of earnings scale earn. In very simple terms, David, and some housing associations have made this more simple now. It effectively equates to a full-time job at minimum wage. So
right.
20% is pretty much,
Yeah,
you know, at the minimum wage levels now. And of course, we've seen minimum wage levels rise quite significantly, both under the previous Tory government
yep,
in Westminster, and I think we'll see a continued commitment
yes,
to that in the new Labour administration. But in simple terms, it says, well, the average income of somebody that's likely to live in social housing starts off at,
yeah,
you know, sort of full-time earnings at national minimum wage.
yes,
And then it takes a percentage of that, currently takes 28% of that, and says that's an affordable rent. And I think what we could really well co-produce in Wales between landlords, government, and residents across Wales is there are so many different measures of what's affordable.
yep,
So the 28% by its very nature is a compromise on that. There are different models from a sort of you know, United Nations definition of poverty, a Joseph Rowntree
yes.
definition of poverty, to on an extreme other end, what DWP think is affordable, which would be very
Yes,
unaffordable. I think in
I would
most
like to see theirs, but yeah,
no,
okay.
I don't think many people would consider that to be particularly affordable. But
Yeah,
I think in trying to agree, um, you know, when I was brought up as a kid, my dad always used to say to me, never spend more than a
mm,
third of what you take home on
yeah,
on living.
yeah,
You know, so there's always been something, an idea in that sort of 20 something
yeah,
to a third of being actually that's a reasonable amount of money for somebody to be able to pay
mm,
to afford to live in a property. I think what we could
yeah,
really do well is test that
yes,
and test what I call that kind of whole cost of occupation of a property, because there's that bit that you rightly talk about there, David. You are social housing stock by its nature um, has got a long period of time over which it might have been built. You know, some landlords have old Victorian stock in
yep,
it, obviously an awful lot of post-war 40s and 50s council stock. Social housing tended to build from about the 70s, 80s onwards.
mm.
And if you're on a waiting list at the moment, then your allocation will depend on where you are at a waiting list and what property happens to come up at that time.
And it's
And
a lottery. It's a
it is
lottery.
a lottery, yeah. And
There
they
are
have to,
quotes I've seen with Cardiff Community recently where people have moved into an EPCA new
yeah,
build, and their words were, "I feel like I've won the lottery because it's a beautiful new build that social
yes.
housing does well." You know, yeah,
Yeah, 100%. But yet, at the moment, the way that the rent formulation goes, you will be charged the same amount of money if you lived in that one, or if you ended up being allocated a 1947, you know,
yeah,
ex-local authority property. So if you think about living in a home and your costs are your rent, and if you live in a flat, you've probably got a service charge on top of that as well. You've got some council tax, which is something that we all have to,
mm,
you know, that we all have to pay. The vast majority of people have to pay, and you've got the cost of heating and lighting your home. I think there's something that we could think about in terms of lived, you know, residents bringing lived experience to that. Because there's lots of data out there, David, on this
yeah,
stuff, but
yeah,
there's also hearing the real lived experience of what that
absolutely.
means for people. And if we work together on that, I think we could come up with a clearly understandable definition of why a rent model might be set at something like, you know, 28, 26,
Yeah,
31, whatever number you come up with, percent of, you know, percent of income, and how that number might be different dependent upon how much it costs you to heat and light that property,
yeah,
or how much the heat and light costs in that property. So I think there's something really interesting in that. And actually, that was the premise of some of the work that was done many years ago to put
yes,
this rent model into place. But you know, even I would struggle to understand and explain what that looked like now, having been involved in it 15 years ago or whatever,
yeah,
13 years ago when that happened. So it gets quite challenging to understand that. And I think we need a whole relook at that thing that people actually that people are actually able to clearly, landlords are able to articulate and residents are able to understand how that's actually been put together.
And I think service charges comes into that as well, mate.
100%.
In Northern Ireland, it's part of the cap.
Yeah.
You know, we're building more flats. We don't build bungalows now. We build flats for people. We more and more places got service charges and much more expensive service charges, fire safety and things like that. And that's something that comes up a lot in that affordability of that, you know.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting debate that we should have amongst ourselves as landlords and with residents and with government about service charges, because if you remember, in days of old, councils would charge a single rent. So the service charge was embedded within the rent.
Yes.
If you're a private landlord in Wales at the moment, you're not allowed to charge a service charge, so you simply charge a rent. And in social housing now, you charge a rent with a separate service charge. And I think there are pros and cons to that, which are worth us debating and exploring through all of those.
That might be another TPAS session. Yeah,
because I think there's the transparency angle of a service charge, but there's also its variability. And actually, would it be better if the landlord had to stick within a fixed cost of the service charge? Because if you think of a landlord providing maintenance services to a property, those are variable by property, and yet the resident in that property will get charged the same rent, you know, because 1 year it may need a kitchen, it doesn't need another one for 15 years. Equally, service charges can be variable in terms of there may be something happens to a lift, but if the landlord's done something to that lift, it'll be 15 years before one's done again. So there's some things which are a bit, you know, lumpy. So I think that's another one that's debate. But in any way that we think about rent, we can't just think about rent. You have to think about rent and and service charges, because that's part of what I would call that whole cost of living in a property. You can't just look at that rent in isolation. You have to look at what are the basics that you need in order to be able to live in any property.
And we're demanding more from service charges and new estates with unadopted roads and the private playgrounds in them now and all sorts of stuff, isn't that you wouldn't have had in the past as well?
And you know, we are all a victim of the austerity that we've had in central government and local authorities just not willing to adopt roads anymore, not willing to maintain playgrounds anymore. More and more of that responsibility being passed over to landlords and other third sector organisations.
So in terms of other ways we could do it, then you talk about getting back to that affordability model. Is that how you would like to see it go? Or
I'd very much
ways we could do this.
I would like to see us move away from two things, I suppose. The link to CPI is always somewhat of an artificial one in some way. CPI as an inflation measure is a product of a whole series of things that are not necessarily related to housing. And I suppose I'd like to move it away from being a political decision to being a decision that's based on, you know, a clearly understandable set of data. So if you were to say that actually rent increases every year are governed by a living rent model, and the living rent model is governed by the increase in average earnings over a year, that would feel like a better and more appropriate way for us to set rents on an annual basis, because it does take some of the political element out of it, and some of this I'm sure politicians won't like me saying it's not the easiest judgment for a politician to have to make every year. So you take some of that, but obviously it could also be used as a political tool and the lever of whatever government one has at a point in time. Whereas I think for both residents and landlords, actually having something where, because I think what we've had, David, is a bit of a misnomer in these 5-year rent settlements, that actually that is going to be what happens in each of those 5 years. So I don't think it provides certainty for either the landlord or the resident in what's actually going to happen in that period of time. So I'd like us to look at something which was a genuinely co-produced affordability model, and then an annual increase in that affordability model was determined more by increase in incomes, because I think that's the thing that's most directly relevant to somebody living in a property is the change in, is the change in income that somebody has. So and I think that and that will mean that there are periods of time for landlords where if the economy isn't doing so well and incomes aren't rising,
Mm.
then the landlord would not expect to get much, if any, of a rent increase at that period of time. But surely that would be right in the context of what's going on in society at that point in
Yeah.
point in
We
time.
saw the triple lock, and that maintained at 10% when we were capping at 6% and things. There's a number of, as I say, I think an expert panel or review that's needed in this to take away from the politics.
Yeah,
Which happened with the living wage, didn't it? A minimum wage. Sorry, there is a formula and input with science and
yeah, yeah,
different stakeholders to try and they provide a recommendation to government
yeah.
on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think politicians may not want to lose overall control of it, but at least if we moved away from a CPI measure to a proposal around actually how have earnings generally moved over a 12-month period, and therefore what would be appropriate at that point in time, feels like a better way. It feels like it's more linked to that affordability question, which is where I'd like us to
Okay.
to have, because we will hear lots of feedback from residents around affordability,
Mm.
and in that conversation, affordability is as wide as you can make it. People have different definitions of what they believe is affordable and not affordable, and inevitably we have to come to some consensus on that.
Yeah.
But it would be better if we came to a co-produced census on that, a
And I
consensus.
think those factors, like we mentioned earlier, energy efficiency would be one. You
Yeah,
could
100%.
argue location does matter if you're up in Powys somewhere, or
Yeah,
and you haven't got bus services or
yeah,
train. I think Trevallis had a famous picture of Mardy and
they did.
Clean, didn't it? And
Yeah,
one had bus and train and rail services, and the other one didn't, and they were charging the same price at that time, and they were questioning.
yeah. And Trevallis did some
Yeah,
Trevallis did some excellent work in
yeah,
terms of actually segmenting their rents down right to the local authority, right to the wards within there.
yeah,
Within the local authority, within local authority area. And you're right, the access to, um, if the premise of the model is that if you are unable to work, then benefits will cover your rent. But if you're working, then a lot of the model is based on the premise that you are working,
yeah,
and that ability to get to work is a factor in
yeah.
that part of it, isn't it?
Yes.
We know how much in South Wales that Cardiff draws people in
Yeah.
to work in an economic hub that's in
Mm.
that's in Cardiff. We know in rural Wales, and lots of the areas we operate in rural Wales, it's pretty much impossible to have work without owning a car.
Yeah.
That brings a
I
cost
mean,
into it.
this is my background. I can cycle over the barrage to work, and
Yeah,
Cardiff. It's a different model, isn't it, to
yeah,
parts of Wales? Yeah.
different model. But then there's also an interesting thing on the other side. The minimum wage is set at the same level, and it isn't a regionalised minimum
Yeah.
wage. But there are those that argue that it should be in that.
Yeah.
So I think all of these things are well worth a good discussion, and I would really hope that this review that Welsh Government have called now allows landlords, allows government, allows residents, and our local authority partners as well to come round the table and co-produce something together.
Yeah.
Because I think what we've always proved in Wales is where we work together on things, and people work together, we actually produce really good outcomes.
TPAS would very much endorse that as getting tenants and landlords to talk and engage and work together on
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
And I know that work does happen in places across Wales.
Yeah. And the great beauty of Wales, David, is that we are close to the politicians. We're not like we're in England, where you would be a tenant body in England and we would be a small landlord in England. And it's quite difficult to have those conversations directly with government. We do have that here. And so that ability to come and work with government, with residents, with local authorities, with landlords, and say, actually, let's come together and think of something on this, I think is really powerful, and would achieve something that was much more understandable for people in the current system that we've got at the moment.
So how do you make sure that we don't create an industry out of this then? Because obviously with Wales and West, you've got some big teams and big data behind you. You've got different types of landlords. How do we avoid it becoming an industry in its own right, that becomes complex and stuff?
I think what we want to do is we need to, in all of these things, if you spend the time in trying to get it right at the start and leave then a really simple mechanism going forward for it, I think we have to accept the political pragmatism that you're probably going to set this Senedd term by Senedd term, so it's going to be something that any politician if you ever got a change of government in Wales, is going to want to look at every 5 years or whatever. But actually, if you set in train a way, an understanding of how we're going to understand affordability, and then a way that moves on an annual basis, then it should be something it becomes much less subjective than the minister sort of what she does at the moment a lot is, well, I've got a formula, but I'm going to go talk to lots of people and I'm going to take a subjective view about what I might do at that point in time. And if we made it more objective at that point in time and clear and clearly understandable, the rent has changed this year, factor and this factor, and that's the only things we consider, then I think we do avoid that thing, David, of making it an industry. And people feel that the outcome of what we put in place has actually been created by lots of people working to get that right. That leaves a nice simple legacy that then works onwards from there. That's certainly what I would hope for out of this.
One of the things when you see some of the like CHC and people like that, they talk about the need for a clear 5-year plan in order for the banks and stuff and finances to understand it. When we poll tenants, they're like, it should be done every year just based on where we are each year. Why do landlords need that certainty, and how do we get that so that it does take into account local or the conditions of the time, but how do we get it so that they also need that? Why do they need that certainty?
Landlords primarily need that certainty in order to be able to build new homes. In a perfect world, David, we would go back to where we used to, where the state built homes, but sadly that disappeared 40 odd years ago now, so I don't think we're ever getting back to that stage.
It's not coming back,
unfortunately not. So we are in the reality now where in order to build new social homes, then landlords have to go out and seek finance for that. For that money, it's no longer state finance. Clearly, we get an element of grant towards a new home, but obviously it used to be 100% grant. The state was building those homes in the day. So whenever you are then exposing yourself as any organisation to borrowings and financial markets, then they need to see certainty that money can be repaid. So and banks in general like certainty. They like as much certainty as they can possibly get. I suppose I always question how much certainty we are actually able to give funders, because 5-year rent settlements, as we've seen over the last 5 years, have not actually turned out to be what they.
Two of them got capped at least, wasn't it?
Yeah. Whenever I talk to a funder, what I talk about is that sadly, within the society that we have created, there is an almost insatiable need for more social housing, and there is almost an insatiable demand for social housing. I wish that wasn't the case in our society, but sadly it is. And so from a funder's point of view, if you're looking at us one day, because the funders are not specialist social housing funders, they lend to everybody in society. I've worked in plenty of businesses before I came into social housing where you're never quite sure what your revenue is 1 year ahead or 2 years ahead. In social housing, we know that we are going to charge rents for many, many more years, and our properties are always going to be lettable for that period of time. So actually, that's the bigger certainty that funders get is the sad reality that we could let every one of our homes 2 or 3 times over at the moment. We only have to look at the amount of people that are on waiting lists at the moment. And so that's the real certainty that funders get, is actually that you've got a predictable amount of revenue that you're going to be able to charge. Of course, housing associations work incredibly hard with their residents in order to those residents can then pay that rent. Back around the circle that we've just talked about how do we make sure that rent's genuinely affordable through that, because that's also a really important part of a housing association's business model, is that it has, in our case, 12,500 properties. We believe that we will always be able to let those 12,500 properties, and as long as we can recover our rent on those properties, then from a funding proposition, we are a really good funding proposition to build new homes. Now, one of the things our residents, it's always an interesting one. When somebody is on a waiting list, they want you to build more homes. When somebody gets a home, they don't particularly want to pay more rent for you to build somebody else. No, that's a gross exaggeration.
But we have discussed this. I remember me and you being in down Port Talbot, and I'm like, if this was a private landlord saying we need to charge above inflation every year to build more homes, we'd be outraged. But in social housing, it's acceptable that people pay above inflation.
Yeah,
and to pay a new home tax of some sort. I know it's
yeah.
not as simple as that, but that's how it
No,
seems. Yeah.
but yeah, and it can be seen as that, and that again, I think is again the reality of the situation we're in at the moment. The state is not willing to fund 100% of a
Mm.
new social home. We have, I feel a massive responsibility in a housing association to not only do the very best that we can for our residents that are in our homes,
Mm.
but also to do the very best for those who haven't been able to access one as well. And so we do see ourselves as having a dual purpose,
Mm.
and we're absolutely aware that for some people that doesn't sit well
No.
in that part
No.
of it. But I can't sit there in a housing association and look at the amount of people that want social housing and have, in my opinion, the absolute right to be in social housing, that are sitting on a waiting list and not still work very hard to try and build new homes,
Yeah.
as well as trying to keep our old homes to the very best standards we can. And that's in running a housing association, that's the constant juggling act
Yeah.
that we are doing.
And the affordability of it for the existing, but funding new ones. Yeah. Yeah.
Funding new ones as well, and that's forever the challenge. But a challenge that I think we're all, we would all, whilst it can be, whilst it's not always palatable,
Mm.
is a challenge that we would always stand behind, because I do believe that our role is to do both of those, is to do both of those things, and then we have to manage those trade-offs as best we can between
Yeah.
those two parts of it. And I would stand proud of the fact that we built 2,500 homes in the time that I've been at Wales and West. That's
Yeah.
2,500 more individuals or families
Yes.
that have now got a secure tenancy and a roof over their head and a chance to make a life that they didn't have before that point in time. That's really important.
Oh yeah, I mean, we see the stories of the temporary accommodation, the B and B's, and it's some of it is, well, grim isn't a word for it, is it? It's just horrific, some of it. However much the local authorities try their best.
Yeah.
Okay,
There's
so
nobody in here. There's nobody in this system that isn't trying their best out of it at the moment.
mm,
We live in sadly in a society that has a dysfunctional marketplace,
mm,
where the cost of housing and incomes have just drifted,
yes,
in my lifetime,
oh yeah, yeah,
to a ridiculous, to a
yes,
ridiculous degree apart, and
yeah,
and the consequence of that is an ever increasing need for social housing
yeah.
that wouldn't be there if home ownership was within reach of many more people.
And I think we've squeezed the private sector, the private rental sector, to
Yes.
some ridiculous, there's some terrible rents and terrible things out there now in the private rental sector. Can't
Yeah.
rely on that to be the solution either. Yeah.
No, I know, and we will have to. Social housing can do so much. There will have to be, for all some of the flaws that there are in the Renting Homes Act, the premise that the minister had in that of trying to professionalise the private rented sector is a laudable aim.
Yeah.
The consequence was always going to be, you were going to squeeze a bit out of, you were going to make this, and it is good to see that in Wales, at least in some of the big cities, there is more kind of institutional investment going into private rented sector to try and increase supply of private rented sector property as well, because we have to solve the whole housing market, not just our part of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the next year, we're both in that working group. What can I ask what you will, the three things or two things, I put you on the spot a bit here. This is not, what are the two or three things you're going to ask for or call for in that?
So, I think we share a common aim, David, that having you and I having both been through these reviews before, this review is going to hopefully finish at a time that then we get a new government. And my first hope would be that the new government, whatever we came up with, provided it wasn't what we're currently doing now, that the new government was willing to adopt what we did. And that became the blueprint for the next NF from 2026 to 2031. So my overarching hope is that this is work that is worthwhile, and that produces something different. That a new government in May 26, when we get a new government in Wales, that it takes that on through those 5-year periods. I very much hope that is a way of setting social housing rents that is clearly and easily understandable around affordability. That would be my overarching hope for it all, because I think it just makes the situation so much better for everybody if it's simple and it's understandable and
Yeah.
it's related to affordability. And if we could co-produce that over the next 18 months and a new government took that on board into the next Senedd, I would feel hugely proud to have been part, a very small part, but a
Yeah.
part of that work and that working group to do that. And I think that would serve everybody involved really well if that's what we achieved.
Excellent. Good. Thank you for this. I suppose the final question is how confident do you think we'll just end up like the English government with a CPI +1? Can I put you on the spot for that?
I really hope not.
Yeah.
I understand why England are doing it. I think in general, and if I talk about the vast majority of the time, I know anybody can always point to the odd outlier of cases where a housing association or a council hasn't done the right thing or the property's not in the right state. But in general, England really suffered from George Osborne's austerity in freezing rents in England,
Yes.
in English landlords being forced to cut that long-term investment in their properties. And I think they are. We talk a lot in my association. I know it's shared by many of my colleagues about you've got to invest the right amount in the long term of properties. And if you stop doing that, it will always come back and haunt you at a point in time. And I think that's where England are now.
And I think some of those damp and mold, and there was a culture as well, but there was an underinvestment from that George Osborne period, that
damp and mold, I think, is an absolute one of those where some of the things, where some of those things that you would do to the fabric of buildings to make them better just genuinely got cut. Those big investment programs got cut, and it comes back, and with AWAB Isaac in Rochdale, it comes back in tragic ways to bear. And I think you're right. There was a cultural issue in that particular housing association, but there was a societal issue driven by UK government policy that drove that. But from a generally, if you in England, I think that's the CPI +1 is a reaction to they've got to get their buildings back in order. Yeah. I think in Wales we're at a different place than that, and so I think we could be more progressive than just that kind of rather blunt.
Our original WHQS was a better standard than Decent Homes
in England, yeah.
Version 1, yeah.
Yeah, and the new WHQS is a better standard again now. So the standard in which we're required to keep our homes is higher, and I think it gives us the chance to be more progressive than that. I think it's a reaction in England to a period of time where they had rent freezes, and I think in Wales we could be more progressive than that, David. So I live in hope. I
think that's a great ending for that. Yes, I think a chance to be more progressive in our rent formula, I think I think that's what we're all looking for, isn't it? Let's see Absolutely. Where the next goes. So thank you, Stuart. Thank you very much for this. I hope you found this interesting, those watching. I think this will be the first of a few. I've grabbed Stuart first because I could see when we're on this committee, I was like, some interesting things to say. So thank you for listening to this, and thank you, Stuart, for taking part. Thank you.
Yeah, absolute pleasure, David.